Imagine waking up in Salem Village, 1692. The air is thick with fear, and your neighbour's cough isn't just illness, it's a sign of the devil's work. Tonight, we'll explore how a single winter turns suspicion into a deadly game of blame. And what does it reveal about the power of fear? Welcome to Salem Village, where winter isn't just weather, it's God's examination room. The cold seeped into everything, from the crooked floorboards of meeting houses to the marrow of Puritan bones. Every frozen morning was another question. Were you faithful enough to survive this test? So, before you get comfortable, maybe pull your blanket a little tighter. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on that fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lived by a simple equation. Suffering meant sin, blessings meant virtue. When cattle collapsed in their pens, or children's feverish cheeks turned from pink to grey, it wasn't misfortune, it was judgment. Ministers paced their pulpits like angry physicians, diagnosing moral rot behind every hardship. There were no accidents here, only punishments you'd earned. Grain stores shrank faster than usual, frost killed crops still in the ground, and something vile wriggled into the drinking water. Children convulsed with seizures that made their limbs jerk like puppets cut from strings. Midwives came bearing herbs and prayers, but the usual remedies failed. Medicine couldn't treat what wasn't, strictly speaking, a physical ailment. People counted their neighbours' sins like arithmetic. That family skipped Sabbath service twice last month. Those girls giggled during the last baptism. That old woman still mumbled when she thought no one heard her. When suffering outran explanations, someone had to be failing worse than the rest. Church benches creaked under the weight of anxious bodies every lecture day. Sermons catalogued new transgressions. A lace collar here, an unguarded laugh there. Each petty fault, another crack in the village's spiritual armour. The devil wasn't knocking at Salem's door. They'd already let him in through these small surrenders. But where exactly was he hiding? Scapegoats work best when they're specific. A harsh winter might be divine displeasure at the community, but a witch? That was a target you could actually fight. Farmers who couldn't save their cattle could still drag an old woman to court. Parents powerless against their children's fevers could at least make someone answer for them. The weather created perfect conditions for this reckoning. Long nights trapped families together in smoky cabins, whispering about who might be the weak link. Frozen ground prevented travel that might have diluted the tension. Even the meeting house felt closer in winter, every cough, every suspicious glance magnified by proximity. Meanwhile, the afflicted children worsened. Their fits followed patterns no natural illness should, synchronized like some awful choir. When doctors threw up their hands, everyone knew what that meant. The diagnosis had been waiting in plain sight all along, written in icy fields and wheezing livestock, and a preacher's narrowed eyes. Betty Paris's convulsions weren't just a girl's suffering. They were Salem's fever breaking. Every jerk of her limbs pointed an invisible finger. The village had its answer now, gleaming and sharp as the icicles hanging from the meeting house eaves. Witchcraft wasn't some distant fear anymore. It wore the face of your neighbour, your midwife, the woman who sold you eggs last summer. By the time the first accusations flew, they hardly needed evidence. The snowbanks grew higher, the accusations louder, and suddenly everyone remembered odd moments from years past. That strange smile, the peculiar way she handled herbs. Proof wasn't the point anymore. The important thing was that finally someone would pay. Farmers who couldn't save a single squash plant could now rip evil out by its roots. Parents powerless against their children's suffering would make the witches suffer instead. The ice would break on the Charles River before Puritan resolve would. One confession would lead to 5 accusations, those 5 to 50, until the whole colony shuddered under the weight of its own certainty. The pattern repeated like frost forming on glass. First random crystals, then an unstoppable crystalline web. By spring, they wouldn't recognize what they'd built in the dark. Salem wasn't just a place, it was two worlds at war. On one side stood Salem town, with its bustling port and merchants counting coins by candlelight. On the other, Salem village, where farmers measured wealth in bushels and blisters. The salt-tinged air of the harbour never quite reached the village's dirt lanes. It was theology, money, and power simmering in the same cracked pot. The village clung to its identity like a badge. They were the pure ones, the ones who kept the old ways while the town grew soft. Their meeting house had no decorations, just rough-hewn pews, and a minister who preached hellfire without notes. Meanwhile, town churches imported silver communion cups. Village farmers watched their sons leave for apprenticeships in town, returning with strange ideas about fashion and Sabbath observance. Every trip to market rubbed their faces in it. The fine fabrics, the imported sugar, the jokes about country cousins. Village farmers owed rents to town landlords who'd never turned soil in their lives. Taxes flowed toward town coffers to pave streets the farmers rarely used. The village had to beg for its own minister, then haggle over his firewood allowance. Meanwhile, town merchants built summer homes on village land, tearing down stone fences for better views. Resentment didn't just grow, it put down roots. Church politics turned petty feuds into holy wars. The village couldn't even pick a minister without town approval. Candidates got ranked like cuts of meat. This one too worldly, that one too dull. When they finally chose Samuel Parris, the town elites barely hid their sneers. A failed merchant playing preacher? He preached like a man with something to prove, which is always dangerous. Land disputes turned neighbours into enemies. A rich town widow claimed pasture rights that starved a village family's cows. A village beer brewer found his well mysteriously poisoned after undercutting town tavern prices. Even the dead-caused trouble disputes over burial plots got so heated, some families started digging graves at night. These weren't just arguments, they were scars that lasted generations. When the witch panic started, it didn't take long for old scores to surface. A beggar who cursed merchants' doors when they skimped on alms. The second, a contentious widow sitting on land everyone wanted. The third, an enslaved woman who knew secrets about prominent families. Coincidence doesn't survive long in Salem. They didn't go after obvious targets first, they named the town's embarrassments. The woman who ran an unlicensed tavern where magistrates drank. The gossip who knew which deacon visited the docks after dark. Each accusation forced the town to choose, protect their own or admit witchcraft had infiltrated their polished world. The panic became a perfect weapon, divinely sanctioned vengeance. The town fought back in subtler ways. Juries suddenly remembered standards of evidence when accusations drifted too close to wharf warehouses. But panic, once unleashed, doesn't respect boundaries. When a prominent town wife found herself accused, the rules changed overnight. The same men who'd nod along to spectral evidence now talked of hysteria and overreach. Funny how that works. By spring, the village had burned through its usual suspects and started eyeing its own. Former allies turned on each other. A land dispute here, an inheritance quarrel there, all suddenly explained by witchcraft. The pattern kept repeating, first the powerless, then the inconvenient, finally the accusers themselves. The divide between town and village didn't cause the trials. But like dry tinder next to a struck match, it guaranteed they'd spread. Betty Parris and Abigail Williams didn't have ordinary childhood illnesses. Their symptoms arrived like unwelcome actors stepping onto a stage. Screams that shattered the winter silence, limbs twisting into impossible angles, moments of eerie stillness followed by violent thrashing. The village doctor came, poked, prodded, and left with nothing to offer but a loaded silence. When medicine fails, people start looking for other explanations. At first it was just two girls in Reverend Parris's house, then others joined. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Elizabeth Hubbard. Their fits synchronized like some awful dance. One would scream about pins stabbing her flesh. Another would collapse as if thrown by invisible hands. Watching them was like seeing reflections in broken glass, the same image repeating at jagged angles. Every twitch looked intentional, every cry full of meaning waiting to be interpreted. The community didn't just observe these fits, they participated. Villagers crowded into the Parris home like spectators at a play, whispering interpretations behind their hands. Each new symptom became currency in Salem's economy of fear. When Betty bit her own arm hard enough to draw blood, someone noted the exact shape of the teeth marks. When Abigail claimed to see spectres floating by the rafters, heads followed her gaze without questioning why they saw nothing. Normal childhood behavior became suspicious. If the girls hid under furniture, it was possession. If they refused food, the devil was feeding them. Their periods stopped, their skin grew pale, their eyes developed strange sensitivities, all signs pointing one direction. The more attention they received, the more spectacular their symptoms became. It's amazing what the human body can manifest when surrounded by people waiting to be amazed. The adults asked leading questions designed to confirm what they already believed. Who torments you? Is it Goody Proctor? Does she show you a book? The girls learned quickly what answers brought gasps, what stories made their elders lean forward. Some accusations may have started as games, as ways to make sense of their own bodily distress. But in Salem, games turned serious fast. Court records show how the girls' performances evolved. Early fits were chaotic, collapsing, screaming, random claims of pain. Later, their accusations became oddly specific. They named neighbours the adults already disliked. They described spectral assaults that mirrored Puritan ideas of witchcraft exactly. Their stories were suspiciously well informed for children supposedly out of their minds with demonic torment. Adults rewarded the girls with status they'd never normally possess. Suddenly, their words could send neighbours to jail. Judges leaned close to catch every whispered accusation. Grown men flinched when they pointed trembling fingers. For girls raised to stay silent and less spoken to, this power must have been dizzying. Like any sudden celebrity, they learned to perform what their audience wanted most. Ministers interpreted every jerk and cry as divine messages. Cotton Mather described one fit in detail. The child's neck would twist backwards until her head nearly touched her shoulder blades. Her mouth would stretch wide although no sound emerged. Then suddenly she'd howl like a wounded animal. No one questioned why God would communicate through convulsions instead of clear speech. Spectacle always trumps clarity when fear's involved. The girls' fits followed convenient patterns. They never had episodes when alone, only before reliable witnesses. Their visions always implicated people. The community already distrusted. Their suffering always peaked at key moments, just when public doubt might have grown, just when trials needed momentum. Their timing was impeccable, if one believes in coincidences. As accusations multiplied, the girls developed distinct roles. Ann Putnam became the scribe, naming the highest number of witches. Abigail Williams specialized in dramatic collapses. Mary Walcott excelled at describing invisible attackers. They were teenagers, playing parts in a story adults wrote for them. A story where fantasy and reality blurred until even they may have believed their own act. Village leaders eventually noticed inconsistencies. One girl would accuse a woman of witchcraft, another would later declare that same woman innocent. The afflicted sometimes mimicked each other's symptoms too precisely. Spectators watched as one girl's convulsions would spread through the group like a yawn, suggesting something closer to peer pressure than possession. But doubt came too late. The girl's early fits had already lit a fire that would take 20 lives to extinguish. Their childish games became a script the whole colony followed. Stage directions for mass hysteria written in twitching limbs and wide, frightened eyes, looking at things no one else could see. The first accusations weren't about evidence, they were about convenience. Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Paris household, stood out before she ever spoke a word. Her dark skin marked her as different in a community that measured purity by uniformity. Sarah Good's crime was poverty. She wandered door to door begging, her tattered skirts and sharp tongue making villagers clutch their children closer. Sarah Osborne had committed the sin of remarrying her servant, a scandal that never quite faded. These were women who already lived on the margins, making them perfect targets when the village needed someone to blame. When the girls first named their tormentors, no one was surprised at who they chose. Tituba's stories of Caribbean folklore had fascinated the Paris children before they frightened them. Sarah Good's habit of muttering under her breath suddenly took on new meaning. Were those curses she whispered? Sarah Osborne's failure to attend church regularly wasn't just laziness now, but proof of devil worship. The village didn't need spectral evidence when they had years of petty grievances to draw from. The magistrates didn't bother with careful questioning. They asked leading questions designed to confirm what everyone already believed. Do they pinch you, choke you, show you strange books? The girls, sensing what answers their elders wanted, obliged. Witnesses came forward with stories that grew more elaborate by the hour. How Tituba could make a mirror steam up from across the room. How Sarah Good's touch made milk curdle. How Sarah Osborne's shadow moved independently from her body. The more outlandish the claim, the more eagerly it was accepted. Reason had left Salem the moment the first accusation flew. Tituba understood something crucial early on. Confession meant survival. Under pressure, she spun elaborate tales of red rats, yellow birds, and a tall Boston man in black who made her sign his book. The magistrates lapped it up, their pens scratching furiously to record every bizarre detail. Her stories gave shape to their amorphous fears, turning vague suspicions into concrete crimes. Each new confession bought her time, even as it condemned others. Sarah Good took the opposite approach. Defiance. When asked why she tormented children, she snapped that she tormented no one except her abusive husband. Her sharp tongue sealed her fate. Villagers suddenly remembered how crops wilted after she passed by, how animals grew skittish in her presence. Her 4-year-old daughter, Dorcas, wasn't spared. The child was jailed in chains, her small size no protection against the hysteria. Poverty had made Sarah vulnerable, her refusal to play the meek penitent made her expendable. Sarah Osborne's case proved you didn't even need a trial to be convicted by public opinion. Already ill when arrested, she languished in jail while magistrates debated her case. The cold, filthy conditions worsened her condition until she died before facing official judgment. No matter. Her death was taken as divine confirmation of guilt. The village hadn't needed to execute her. Neglect served just as well. What's chilling isn't that these women were targeted, but how predictable it was. Every witchcraft panic follows the same pattern. First the enslaved, the poor, the socially awkward. Communities never start by accusing their pillars. They test the waters with those least protected. Tituba's confession gave permission to widen the net. Sarah Good's defiance justified harsher measures, and Sarah Osborne's death showed what happened to those who couldn't defend themselves. The court records reveal how the questioning progressed, from curious to coercive within hours. Magistrates alternated between threats and leading questions. Who appeared to you? What did they promise you? Who else have you seen at their meetings? Witnesses who'd ignored these women for years suddenly remembered every odd glance, every strange utterance. Normal human behavior morphs into something sinister when viewed through the lens of collective panic. By the time these first 3 cases concluded, the template was set. Subsequent accusations followed the same roadmap. Start with social outcasts. Extract confessions through pressure. Use those confessions to implicate others. Each successful prosecution made the next one easier, until accusation became its own proof. The machinery of the trials needed those first 3 women to grease its wheels, not because they were guilty, but because they were vulnerable. What happened to them afterward tells its own story. Tituba disappeared from the records after her jailer sold her to pay her fees, her ultimate fate unknown. Sarah Good went to the gallows cursing her accusers, her last words promising God would give them blood to drink. Sarah Osborne's body was dumped in an unmarked grave, her property swiftly divided among her accusers. The village got what it wanted: scapegoats to absorb their fears, and a model for how to produce more whenever needed. These first cases prove something dark about human nature. It's easier to blame the vulnerable than confront real problems. The failing crops, the political divisions, the gnawing uncertainty of frontier life, none of these had quick solutions. But a witch? You could hang a witch. The trials didn't start with mass hysteria. They started with 3 women who never stood a chance, and a village that desperately needed someone to punish. Tituba's confession wasn't just words. It was the spark that lit the bonfire. When the magistrates pressured her, she didn't just admit to witchcraft. She gave them a whole cosmology of evil, complete with a devil in black, a magical book, and spectral animals. Her story was too perfect. It confirmed every Puritan nightmare about how witchcraft should work. The more she spoke, the wider the magistrates' eyes grew. They weren't just hearing a confession, they were getting an instruction manual. She described the devil as a tall man from Boston with white hair and ragged clothes. He carried a book, she claimed, and when she touched it, red rats and yellow birds appeared. The details were vivid enough to feel true, the kind of specifics that make even skeptics pause. She talked about signing the book, about other witches gathering in the woods, about pinching the girls because the devil commanded it. Every new detail built a fuller picture, one that matched exactly what the village feared most. What's chilling isn't that Tituba lied, but how well she lied. She gave the court everything it wanted: names, methods, motives. When asked who else was involved, she didn't hesitate. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were just the start. She described meetings in meadows where witches plotted, their spectres flitting through the night to torment the godly. Her stories transformed vague suspicions into concrete crimes. Suddenly, every unexplained illness, every dead cow had a culprit. The magistrates didn't realize they were being led. They thought they were uncovering truth. Tituba's confession worked because it played on existing fears. Puritan sermons had spent years describing the devil's tactics, how he seduced the weak, how he kept ledgers of sinners. Her story mirrored those warnings exactly. When she mentioned the devil's book, every listener recalled their minister's warnings about signing away one's soul. Her descriptions of spectral animals matched folk beliefs about witches' familiars. She wasn't inventing from nothing. She was assembling a patchwork of local fears into something that felt unbearably real. Her performance was masterful. She knew when to tremble, when to pause for effect, when to drop a new bombshell. The magistrates ate it up, their quills scratching frantically to record every word. Other accused witches would later copy her approach, but none matched her skill. She set the standard for how a proper confession should sound, detailed enough to be believable, theatrical enough to be unforgettable. The court didn't just accept her story, they celebrated it as divine revelation. While others swung from gallows, she stayed alive in jail. Smart move. The magistrates protected their star witness, even as her words sent others to their deaths. She gave them what they craved most, validation that their witch hunt was justified. Every new name she provided, every lurid detail she added, tightened the noose around Salem's neck. The court's hunger for confessions grew with each session. If Tituba could name 6 witches, why not 60? Her impact went beyond the courtroom. Villagers started seeing what she described. A shadow became a spectral bird. A neighbour's cough mirrored the choking fits Tituba had mentioned. Her words didn't just record events, they created them. The afflicted girls took notes, their performances growing more elaborate as they incorporated Tituba's imagery. Soon, everyone was speaking her language. The trials became a self-fulfilling prophecy, with Tituba's confession as the founding text. The court records show how her testimony evolved. Early statements were hesitant, vague. Later ones dripped with chilling specifics. She learned quickly what details got reactions. The red rat bit especially pleased the magistrates. Her later confessions included rides through the air, banquets with the devil, even a magical snake that fed on her blood. Each new admission raised the stakes, making earlier accusations seem tame by comparison. The madness had its logic. Once you've admitted to flying, why not admit to poisoning wells too? Tituba's legacy isn't just about her survival, it's about how easily panic takes root when someone gives it shape. She didn't start the trials, but she handed the town a script. Every subsequent case followed her template. Spectral evidence, devil's pacts, coerced confessions. By the time she faded from the records, sold to pay her jail fees, her ultimate fate unknown, her stories had taken on a life of their own. The witch trials became a runaway production, with Tituba's words as the opening act. What's telling is how little it took to satisfy the court. They didn't need physical evidence, just a good story. Her confession did more than condemn a few innocents. It trained an entire community to see witchcraft in every shadow. The magistrates thought they were extracting truth. Really, they were just taking dictation from their own fears. The courtroom in Salem wasn't about finding truth. It was about putting on a show. When an accused witch entered, the afflicted girls didn't just sit quietly. They screamed. They convulsed. They clutched their throats as if invisible hands choked them. The more dramatic the performance, the more convinced the judges became. Every gasp and twitch got recorded as official evidence. You didn't need physical proof when you had such good theatre. The magistrates played their parts perfectly. They'd lean forward when the girls shrieked, nod gravely when spectral wounds appeared, and scowl at the accused. Their robes might as well have been costumes. The real script was simple. The girls performed suffering, the judges performed wisdom, and everyone else performed belief. Anyone who broke character by expressing doubt risked becoming the next accused. Better to applaud than question. Audiences packed the room like patrons at a play. Villagers craned their necks to see the latest accusations, murmuring approval when the girls pointed at someone new. The air stank of unwashed bodies and tallow candles, adding to the surreal atmosphere. Some spectators brought food, treating the trials like dinner theatre. They'd gasp on cue, murmur prayers at dramatic moments, and exchange knowing looks when particularly damning evidence emerged. Their presence wasn't accidental. Crowds added pressure, making acquittals impossible. The proceedings followed predictable rhythms. An accused woman would enter, and the girls would immediately react as if scalded. Their fits followed patterns, first paralysis, then screaming, then accusations spat between gasps. Judges would ask leading questions, "Is this the woman who hurts you?" And the girls would collapse again for confirmation. The whole thing ran like a well-rehearsed morality play, just with real lives at stake. Physical evidence didn't matter here. When accusers claimed witches sent spectres to pinch them, magistrates examined their arms for marks. No bruises, that just proved the devil's magic was strong. A perfectly calm defendant, clearly the composure of a practiced deceiver. Even silence became suspicious. Why wouldn't an innocent person defend themselves vigorously? The rules constantly shifted to ensure the performance could continue. Logic had left the building weeks ago. The girls developed their roles like method actors. Some specialized in visions, others in physical fits. They borrowed details from each other's testimonies, refining their craft with each session. One might start writhing, and within minutes 3 others would mimic her movements. Their coordination was remarkable for people supposedly not in control of their actions. The magistrates didn't notice, or chose not to, how the afflictions always happened at dramatically convenient moments. Confession scenes became crowd favourites. When a suspect finally broke and admitted witchcraft, the whole room leaned in. These weren't quiet admissions. They were full performances, complete with trembling hands and tearful revelations. The judges coaxed increasingly elaborate stories, rewarding the most outlandish details with nods of approval. One woman claimed to have flown on a pole to secret meetings. Another described baking a witch cake with urine and rye. The wilder the story, the more it confirmed the court's assumptions. Dissent had no place in this theatre. When someone pointed out inconsistencies, why did spectres only appear to certain people, they got shouted down. A man who suggested the girls might be faking found himself accused within days. The script only worked if everyone played along. Even the accused started following the expected arc: denial, resistance, then broken confession. The few who refused to perform their roles faced the ultimate penalty. Each successful trial raised the stakes for the next. Yesterday's shocking confession became today's baseline. What started as pinches and whispers escalated to elaborate tales of demonic banquets and midnight flights. The court records read like bad fantasy novels, filled with shape-shifting animals and magical powders, yet everyone treated them as solemn truth. Reality had become whatever the loudest people in the room agreed upon. The trials didn't end because people stopped believing, they ended when the performances became twos. When accusations reached the governor's wife and other untouchable figures. Suddenly, the same magistrates who'd applauded spectral evidence found their skepticism. The girls' fit stopped entertaining when they implicated powerful families. The show could only run as long as the audience remained in charge of casting. What's chilling is how ordinary it all felt to participants. Day after day, they'd file into court like it was Sunday service, watch the spectacles unfold, then go home to supper. The routineness made the horror worse. Writing warrants became bureaucratic paperwork. Scheduling executions turned into calendar coordination. Behind every witch trial is the boring truth that most atrocities don't feel extraordinary to those committing them, just another day's work. Sarah Good didn't beg. When they dragged her into that courtroom heavy with pregnancy and accusations, she met her judges with a glare that could freeze fire. Here was a woman who'd spent years begging door to door, swallowing insults with her crusts of bread, but she wouldn't swallow this. The magistrates leaned in, expecting the usual script, denials dissolving into terrified confessions. Instead, Sarah spat back. When they asked why she hurt the children, she snapped that she only hurt the ministers who hurt her. When pressed about her supposed witchcraft, she turned to the afflicted girls and snarled, "You're liars, and I'm no more a witch than you are wizards." That last word landed like a curse. Wizards implied male power, a direct challenge to the entire court's authority. The reaction was instant. The girls wailed as if scalded. One swore Sarah's spectre was biting her. Another clawed at her neck, screaming that invisible fingers choked her. The magistrates scribbled notes, their quills scratching faster than ever. Sarah's defiance wasn't just insolence. What innocent person wouldn't grovel? Only someone with the devil's protection would stand this straight. Her trial became a masterclass in Puritan logic traps. If she cried, it showed guilt. If she stayed calm, it proved the devil fortified her. When she pointed out she couldn't possibly torment people from a jail cell, they countered that her spectre could. Even her poverty got weaponized. Why else would she beg unless Satan denied her honest work? The court twisted everything she did into evidence, like a blacksmith hammering nails into her own coffin. Her 4-year-old daughter Dorcas wasn't spared. They hauled the child into court, filthy and shivering in chains smaller than most dog collars. When the toddler didn't provide useful answers, the jailer helpfully testified that the girl had tried to fly in her cell. No one questioned how a starving 4-year-old might behave in solitary confinement. Sarah watched this farce with dry eyes. She already knew how it ended. Her execution day played out as grim theatre. Soldiers had to carry her to Gallows Hill, not because she resisted, but because pregnancy had swollen her ankles beyond walking. The crowd muttered when she refused the minister's last prayer. Then she turned to Reverend Noyes and delivered the line Salem would never forget. "You're a liar. I'm no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take my life, God will give you blood to drink." Noyes flushed scarlet, but kept his mouth shut. Years later, when he died hemorrhaging blood from the mouth, half of Salem would recall her words and shudder. What's chilling isn't that Sarah fought, it's how little it mattered. The magistrate spent pages on the girl's dramatic fits, but summarized Sarah's defense in 3 words. She denies it. Sarah's crime wasn't witchcraft, it was reminding them this wasn't divine justice, just people hurting people. Her hanging didn't stop the trials. If anything, it validated them. See how fearless the court was, executing even a pregnant woman. See how the devil made some too stubborn to repent. But Sarah's ghost lingered. When accusations later reached respected women, some jurors recalled how easily they'd sent a beggar to die. They buried her in an unmarked grave near the gallows, but her family couldn't escape the stain. Dorcas grew up in prison, her childhood spent pacing a cell. Years later, Sarah's husband would testify against other witches, as if cooperation could erase his wife's name. It didn't. Salem remembered Sarah good, not for her innocence but for her refusal to perform remorse. The court needed confessions to sustain its fiction of justice. Sarah handed them nothing but teeth bared in a death grin, proving some flames won't go out, even when you drown them in blood. Her story shows what happens when systems value compliance over truth. They'll call any resistance proof of guilt, any dissent a symptom of evil. But occasionally, just occasionally, someone like Sarah stands crooked in a world demanding straight lines, and the whole edifice shudders. Not enough to fall. Sarah Osborne never had her day in court. By the time the magistrates got around to her case, she was already dead in her jail cell, a fact that surprised exactly no one who'd seen her condition during arrest. The system didn't need a trial to condemn her. Filth, cold, and neglect finished the job faster than any judge's sentence could. They'd tossed her into custody back in March, already weak from what records call long infirmity. The stone floors stayed damp year-round, the straw bedding crawled with vermin, and winter drafts whistled through gaps in the mortar. Sick inmates got the same rations as healthy ones. Thin gruel and hard bread that took more energy to chew than it provided. Osborne's cough worsened by the week, her breathing becoming ragged as wet cloth. No doctor visited, no family brought medicine. She became just another shadow in the corner, waiting for paperwork that kept getting delayed. Her death triggered no particular outcry. In fact, many saw it as divine intervention, God rendering judgment where human courts had stalled. The magistrates noted her passing with the same bureaucratic detachment as recording a spoiled barrel of flour. No need for spectral evidence now, a corpse made better proof than any confession. The afflicted girls, ever attuned to public sentiment, swore they'd seen Osborne's spectre vanish in a puff of sulphur-scented smoke right as she died. Convenient timing. What's revealing is who didn't mourn. Her estranged sons, embroiled in inheritance disputes with her years earlier, kept silent. Neighbours who'd testified against her suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. Even her third husband, the servant she'd scandalously married after her first husband's death, offered no eulogy. If anything, it simplified matters. Dead witches couldn't appeal or recant. They just stayed guilty. Her property told its own story. Now those same parcels passed seamlessly to her accusers, no legal hurdles remaining. The system didn't just punish witches, it rewarded those who helped identify them. In Salem, coincidence had a way of favoring the righteous. Jailers reported something odd about her final days. Whether from illness or resignation, she stopped engaging with guards entirely. Some might call this peaceful. More likely, it was the silence of someone who'd seen enough to know how the story ended. At a certain point, arguing becomes pointless, especially when your jury already believes the dead can testify against you. Her death reshaped the trials in subtle ways. With one original accused gone, attention shifted to fresher targets. The afflicted girls, never ones to waste good material, began incorporating Osborne into their spectral visions. She became a useful prop in their performances. A dead witch meant they could claim ongoing torment without pesky cross-examination. Magistrates obliged by taking posthumous accusations just as seriously as live ones. Why shouldn't they? Ghosts made reliable witnesses when the living lacked credibility. The records show no funeral, no marked grave. Likely they buried her in prison grounds or some unconsecrated plot, though even that's speculative. What is certain is how quickly officialdom moved on. Within weeks, clerks referred to her as the late Osborne in passing, as if noting a settled account. Her death became both precedent and justification. Proof the system worked, even when it technically hadn't operated. After all, how could anyone question trials that produce such efficient results? Word spread through neighbouring towns, carrying a message clearer than any sermon. Resistance was futile. Osborne hadn't cursed like Sarah Good or spun tales like Tituba. She'd just existed inconveniently, then ceased to exist at all. At least hanging was a public event with final words and observers. Dying forgotten in a cell. That could happen to anyone who fell out of favour. When historians call the witch trials a machine, this is what they mean, a system that kept running even when certain parts jammed. Osborne's coffin became another cog in the mechanism. Proving accusations didn't need convictions to be validated, just casualties. And Salem produced those with brutal efficiency, whether by rope, by neglect, or by simply letting winter do its work on frail bodies in unheated cells. Her story lacks the drama of other cases. No last words, no fiery defiance, just a sick woman left to rot. But maybe that's why it matters. The trials didn't always need fiery confrontations to succeed. Sometimes silence worked just as well. As the trials expanded beyond beggars and outcasts to respected church members, some jurors recalled Osborne's quiet end uncomfortably. She'd been problematic, sure, but no one had proven her a witch. Yet she died like one all the same. The lesson wasn't lost on those paying attention. If the system could do that to her, who was next? It's telling that the accusations slowed noticeably after her death became common knowledge. History remembers the hanged, but the forgotten deaths shaped Salem too. Osborne's fate showed what happened when you weren't useful enough to convict, but too troublesome to release. The court didn't kill her directly, it just created conditions where her death became inevitable, then morally convenient. That distinction meant everything to the judges, and nothing to the woman mouldering in an unmarked grave. For every dramatic witch trial climax, there were a dozen quiet tragedies like Osborne's. No spectacle, no crowd, just a faint cough fading in a dark corner while outside. Snow kept falling on a town that had already moved on. Her legacy isn't in court records or dramatic confrontations, but in the chilling realization that sometimes the system doesn't need grand gestures to work as intended. It just needs people to look away at the right moments. And Salem had that down to an art. The accusation started like a slow leak, then burst through Salem with the force of a broken dam. Once people realized how easy it was to name a witch, no evidence required. Every petty feud and neighborly irritation found expression in court documents. A stolen chicken became proof of witchcraft. A lingering cough turned into demonic possession. There was no stopping it once the floodgates opened. The process fed itself. Each confession implicated others, and every new accusation lent credibility to previous ones. If Martha confessed to attending a witch's sabbath and named Goody Johnson, then obviously Goody Johnson was guilty. Why else would Martha say so? Doubting one accusation meant doubting them all, and few had the courage to question the entire system. Better to nod along. Families shattered under the pressure. Husbands testified against wives. Children accused parents. The Putnams, a family with long-standing grievances, became particularly enthusiastic accusers, pointing fingers at rivals who'd crossed them years earlier. Old land disputes, business deals gone bad, even childhood slights were suddenly remembered and punished. Church members found themselves in the dock alongside beggars. Wealthy landowners faced the same hysterical testimonies as the poor. When the wife of a prominent merchant was accused, panic rippled through Salem's elite. The rules had changed. Now, no one was safe. Fear became the town's currency. People whispered accusations first, asked questions. Never. Why take the risk of defending someone when silence kept you safe? Better to join the pointing fingers than become their target. The afflicted girls, sensing their power, grew bolder. Their fits became more extravagant, their accusations more brazen. They'd swipe at invisible spectres, scream about pinching hands, even mimic being hoisted into the air by unseen forces. Judges lapped it up. What began as a local matter now reached across Massachusetts. Officials from Boston rode in to observe the proceedings. The governor formed a special court to handle the growing caseload. With each hanging, the trials gained legitimacy. Executions weren't just punishments, they were advertisements for the court's power. Parents shushed children when they entered the room. The girls learned to wield their influence like a weapon. Pointing at someone could ruin them. Withholding an accusation could spare them. Favor and fear became inextricable. One accuser, after naming dozens, suddenly recanted, claiming the devil had deceived her into false testimony. The court didn't applaud her honesty. She was imprisoned for witchcraft. The message was clear. Once you joined the machine, you didn't get to change your mind. The speed of accusations outpaced reason. At the trial's peak, new cases piled up faster than scribes could record them. Jail cells overflowed. The court had an answer for that too. Satan was making his final push before Christ's return. Even skepticism got folded into the narrative. No profession was immune. Farmers, midwives, even a constable found themselves accused. One man was charged after his dog behaved strangely. Pets weren't safe either. A woman's dog was hanged as her familiar. The madness wasn't just spreading, it was mutating. Wealth provided no escape. Rich suspects could post bail, but their reputations were ruined. The taint of an accusation lingered even after acquittal. Many left Salem rather than live under suspicion. Those who stayed faced social death. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid them. The court's procedures grew more arbitrary. At first there were rules. Spectral evidence required corroboration. Then the rules bent. Then they snapped. Soon, a single accuser's word could doom someone. Judges declared that witches could send spectres to torment victims miles away, making alibis meaningless. The trials weren't just rigged, they'd abandoned logic entirely. By summer, the jails held more accused witches than ordinary criminals. Some prisoners, like Sarah Osborne, died before trial. Others wasted away for months. Families bribed jailers for better conditions, but corruption thrived in the chaos. Yet the machine kept running. Each conviction justified the next. Each hanging silenced potential doubters. The afflicted girls, now seasoned performers, adapted their acts. Spectral pinches gave way to visions of demonic baptisms. The goalposts kept moving, and Salem kept stumbling after them. What started with 3 marginalized women had engulfed the colony. The trials didn't need facts anymore. They had momentum. In Puritan New England, witchcraft wasn't just a crime. It became women's work. Of the hundreds accused during the trials, nearly 80% were female. The numbers tell a story. Men could be sinners, but witches, those were overwhelmingly women. This wasn't coincidence. It was baked into the culture's deepest fears about female power. She attended church without complaint, raised children without spoiling them, and deferred to her husband in all things. Women who didn't fit this mold, widows who managed their own property, healers who knew too much about herbs, poor women who begged instead of marrying, became prime targets. Sarah Good's biggest offence wasn't witchcraft. It was being a nuisance, a woman who refused to disappear quietly into the background. Female behaviour was policed to an exhausting degree. Too much laughter meant frivolity. Too little meant coldness. A woman who argued might have a sharp tongue, but in 1692 that tongue could be the devil's instrument. Even physical traits became suspect. Birthmarks became witches' teats, where familiars supposedly fed. A sharp gaze meant you could curse with your eyes. The standards were impossible. Fail at domesticity and you were incompetent. Excel at it, and maybe you had supernatural help. Marginalized women suffered first, but the accusations quickly climbed the social ladder. Wealthy women weren't immune, just harder to accuse. When they did land in court, their crimes often involved corrupting others. The message was clear. No woman was completely safe from suspicion, because no woman could completely escape her gender's weaker nature. Men weren't entirely absent from the accusations, but their cases followed different rules. Accused men were usually married to witches or related to them. Their alleged crimes involved helping female witches rather than acting independently. One man was hanged, but only after his wife was convicted, and his refusal to confess baffled the court. Male witches defied Puritan logic. Female ones confirmed it. The trials reinforced traditional roles with terrifying efficiency. Obedient women turned informants, accusing nonconformists to prove their own piety. Wives testified against husbands in a rare show of female agency, but only when that agency served the court's narrative. Even the afflicted girls performed a twisted version of proper femininity. Their fits were pure hysteria, the kind of emotional excess Puritans associated with unruly women. The system weaponized femininity against itself. Women's knowledge became particularly suspect. Midwives, often older women with decades of experience, made up a disproportionate number of the accused. Their understanding of birth and herbs looked like magic to suspicious neighbours. A woman who could ease pain or deliver babies had power, and power unsettled people. Better to call it witchcraft than admit women might know things men didn't. Marriage offered little protection. Some husbands stood by accused wives, but many didn't. A few even joined the prosecution, trading their spouses' lives for social standing. Others waited until after executions to remarry quickly, erasing their shame. The trials didn't just punish individual women, they reminded all women how fragile their positions were. The few women who survived did so by performing perfect submission. They cried on cue, praised their interrogator's wisdom, and named other witches enthusiastically. The system rewarded women who embraced victimhood or turned accuser. Resistance, like Sarah Good's, meant death. After the trials ended, women's lives constricted further. Widows found it harder to inherit property. Outspoken women faced harsher punishments. The message had been reinforced: step out of line, and you might not just be shunned, you could be next. The gender divide wasn't incidental to the trials, it was the point. Every accusation reinforced Puritan ideals about how women should behave. Every confession proved women's moral weakness. And every execution showed what happened when women asserted themselves too boldly. We remember the witch trials as a breakdown of justice, but they functioned exactly as intended for gender roles. They made examples of difficult women. They rewarded compliant ones. And they ensured generations of daughters would grow up hearing whispered warnings about what happened to girls who drew too much attention to themselves. The hanging stopped eventually. The lessons didn't. In Salem's court, confession wasn't about truth. The math was simple: admit to witchcraft and live, maintain innocence and die. This wasn't justice, it was survival calculus. The first confessions came from vulnerable targets. Tituba set the pattern when she spun wild tales of devil's books and spectral animals. The magistrates rewarded her with survival, and others noticed. One woman claimed to have flown on a pole. Another described signing Satan's book with blood. The more outlandish the tale, the more eagerly the court accepted it. Reality didn't matter. Only performance did. False confessions didn't just save lives, they fueled the trials. Each admission became proof. Witchcraft existed, making subsequent accusations more believable. It was a self-perpetuating machine. Confessions validated the court's methods, which produced more confessions. The magistrates never questioned why so many devout Puritans were suddenly admitting to serving Satan. They were too busy adding names to their growing list of the damned. The confession process followed a grim script. Accused witches would initially deny everything. Then came the isolation, the sleep deprivation, the leading questions. Some were yelled at for hours, others had loved ones, begged them to confess. The pressure wasn't subtle. One woman later described how magistrates told her flatly, "Confess and live." Recording confessions became its own dark art. Court scribes would helpfully suggest details when memories faltered. Did the devil appear as a man or animal? Were there other witches present? What colour was the mysterious book? Each added particular made the story more convincing, even as it moved further from anything resembling truth. The magistrates weren't documenting reality, they were collaborating on fiction. Some confessions clearly served personal agendas. Children accused parents to escape abuse. Neighbours settled old grudges. One man confessed to witchcraft after his land dispute with a prominent accuser. The system didn't just permit false admissions, it encouraged them. Honesty became suicidal, while lies offered at least temporary safety. The court's treatment of confessors versus deniers sent a clear message. Those who admitted guilt ate better in jail, received visitors, even gained limited freedom. The stubborn ones? They rotted in solitary until execution. The contrast was deliberate, a carrot and stick approach to manufacturing truth. One prisoner reported seeing confessors wearing fine clothes brought from home while holdouts shivered in rags. Recanting carried its own risks. A few brave souls tried withdrawing their confessions, only to face immediate retaliation. The court would either ignore their retractions or charge them with new crimes. One woman who took back her admission found herself accused of witchcraft again, this time for lying to the court. The message was unmistakable. Once you joined their narrative, you didn't get to change the script. Confessions also became tools for social control. Wealthier suspects who confessed might keep some property. Those who refused saw their assets seized entirely. Families of confessors faced less stigma than those of the executed. The system wasn't just punishing witchcraft, it was punishing pride, independence, anything that challenged its authority. The psychological toll was crushing. Many confessors later described breaking under sheer exhaustion. After days without sleep in filthy cells, even the strongest wills crumbled. Some believed their own false admissions afterward. Others lived with lifelong guilt for implicating innocence. One woman spent decades trying to clear the name of someone she'd falsely accused under pressure. What's chilling is how ordinary these coercive tactics were. The magistrates didn't see themselves as torturers, just dutiful men extracting necessary truths. Their methods weren't exceptional by 17th century standards. That's the real horror. The banality of how easily people can be made to condemn themselves and others when the right pressures are applied. The confession ritual ultimately said more about the accusers than the accused. By valuing admission over innocence, the court revealed its true purpose, not justice, but confirmation. Each broken prisoner reaffirmed the judge's worldview, proving Satan was indeed infiltrating Salem. Facts became irrelevant. By the trial's end, over 50 people had confessed to witchcraft. Many were pardoned later when the frenzy passed, but their lives were already ruined. Their reputations never recovered. Their false words had condemned others, and those confessions lived on in court records, permanent stains that outlasted both the accusers and the accused. The confession dynamic shows how easily systems can invert morality. When truth-telling becomes dangerous and lies are rewarded, ordinary people make terrible choices. Salem didn't just execute witches. It created them through pressure, fear, and the basic human instinct to survive another day. The real witchcraft was making good people believe bad things about themselves. They'd admit to vague dealings with Satan, but refused to name others. Others gave obviously false details to signal their duress. One woman claimed the devil appeared as a talking squirrel, a detail so absurd it might have been sarcasm. Even these small acts of defiance often went unnoticed in the rush to condemn. The legacy of these coerced confessions lingers wherever admitting guilt becomes more important than establishing truth. Salem's real lesson isn't about witchcraft. It's about what happens when institutions prioritize convenient stories over messy realities. The court got its confessions. It never got closer to justice. The Salem witch trials didn't end because people suddenly saw reason. They stopped because the accusations finally reached someone who mattered. When rumors touched the governor's own wife, skepticism became fashionable overnight. Funny how that works. For months, the court had operated with brutal efficiency. Poor women, outsiders, and troublemakers made easy targets. But as accusations crept up the social ladder, first to prosperous farmers, then to church deacons, doubts began forming. When someone pointed a trembling finger at the governor's inner circle, the whole machinery shuddered. Suddenly, spectral evidence didn't seem so convincing. The afflicted girl's fits looked less like divine visions and more like bad acting. The system collapsed under its own weight. Ministers who'd championed the trials began preaching about the dangers of false accusations. Juries that had rubber-stamped convictions demanded better evidence. It wasn't conscience that changed minds. It was self-preservation. Public opinion turned, but slowly. Some held out, still convinced Satan had infiltrated Salem. Others quietly wondered if they'd been wrong. Many just wanted to forget the whole mess. The governor stepped in, disbanding the special court that had driven the trials. He ordered remaining suspects released, not because they were innocent, but because continuing had become politically inconvenient. Justice had never been the point. Jails held people whose trials would never finish, their lives permanently in limbo. The afflicted girls, once local celebrities, faded into obscurity. Property disputes lingered for years. Land seized from witches became subject of bitter lawsuits. Some accusers found themselves countersued by victims' families. The legal battles outlasted most participants, a fitting coda to proceedings that had always been about power as much as superstition. The trials left scars deeper than any hangman's rope. Neighbours who'd accused each other couldn't just go back to trading crops. Sunday services became tense affairs, with accusers and survivors sharing the same pews. Some families left Massachusetts entirely, rather than live with what they'd done. Others doubled down, insisting they'd been right all along. A few brave souls tried documenting what really happened. Their accounts met resistance. Official records vanished. Memories became conveniently fuzzy. The colony preferred to move on, treating the trials like a bad dream rather than a systemic failure. When pressure mounted for accountability, the government issued a bland apology, no names named, no one punished. A minister here and there expressed regret, usually while blaming someone else. Typical. The financial costs lingered longest. Jailing hundreds of people wasn't cheap. Executing them cost more ropes, carpenters to build gallows, men to dig graves. Then came the lawsuits, the compensation claims, the lost productivity from a workforce decimated by panic. Salem learned the hard way that witch hunts are expensive. What's striking is how ordinary the end was. No grand revelations, no dramatic confrontations, just a slow realization that continuing might harm the wrong people. The same fear that started the trials eventually stopped them. Not fear of witches, but fear of consequences. The trials didn't so much conclude as run out of fuel. Like a fire that consumes everything flammable then dies. The accusations burned through acceptable targets until only untouchables remained. Without new fuel, the frenzy flickered out. The mechanisms didn't change. People just got better at noticing where the lines were drawn. For the survivors, justice came slowly, if at all. Some received posthumous exonerations years later. Others never cleared their names. Families of the executed carried the shame for generations, their descendants still sensitive about it centuries later. The innocent who'd confessed faced lifelong stigma. No one trusts a self-admitted witch, even a false one. Salem rebuilt, of course. People married, had children, planted new crops over old graves. But something fundamental had shifted. The trials exposed fault lines in Puritan society, about power, about fear, about who gets to decide what's real. Those cracks never fully closed. The true legacy wasn't the body count. It was the realization that any community could do this. Given the right pressures, fear, isolation, a few persuasive liars, ordinary people will repeat Salem's mistakes. The trials didn't end because humanity improved. They ended because the witch hunters finally got scared. Historians still debate precisely when Salem's madness peaked. Some say when they hanged the first woman. Others argue it was when they convicted a respected church member. The truth is, the peak came when accusations reached someone who could fight back. The system worked exactly as designed, until it didn't. In the end, Salem's witch trials consumed themselves. The same forces that drove them, fear, conformity, blind certainty, eventually turned inward. The afflicted girls were discredited. The ministers who'd egged them on distanced themselves. The court that had operated with impunity became a cautionary tale. It's almost poetic, a reminder that no system of injustice remains stable forever. Even witch hunts have expiration dates. The snow melted, the trees budded. Life went on. But something in Salem had frozen that winter. Something that wouldn't thaw just because the weather changed. The real witchcraft had never been about spells or devil worship. It was the magic of making good people believe terrible things. And that magic, as Salem learned, is much harder to break than any curse. Salem didn't forget the trials. It just got very good at looking the other way. They pardoned the dead, reimbursed a few families, then pretended justice had been served. No magistrates lost their positions, no afflicted girls faced consequences, just a quiet agreement to never mention it again, which of course meant everyone kept whispering. Families of the accused carried the weight long after the gallows stopped swinging. Their children couldn't find spouses. Their grandchildren inherited sideways looks at town meetings. The stain didn't wash out, it just faded slightly with each generation. Some changed their names and moved west. Others doubled down, demanding official exoneration that never quite came. Imagine growing up knowing your last name made people cross themselves. The village rebuilt itself around the scars. Neighbours who'd testified against each other now passed in silence at the mill. Farmers who'd seized land from witches suddenly found their crops failing under mysterious circumstances. Church attendance dipped, then rebounded with forced enthusiasm. Everyone knew the real divide wasn't between sinners and saints anymore. It was between those who'd accused and those who hadn't. A few accusers eventually cracked. Ann Putnam Jr., once the most vocal of the afflicted girls, stood before her church in 1706 and confessed she'd been deluded. Her apology letter reads like someone trying to remember a fever dream. The others? Mostly silent. Some married into respectable families. What's telling is how quickly official records disappeared. Court documents vanished from archives. Personal diaries developed sudden gaps. Even the locations of execution sites became forgotten, conveniently, maddeningly lost to time. Salem preferred its ghosts metaphorical rather than marked with plaques. Tourists today can visit a memorial, but good luck finding the actual gallows site. Some forgetting is intentional. Restitution became its own farce. The colony authorised compensation payments in 1711, decades too late for most. Families received about £30 per executed relative, enough to buy a decent cow, but not enough to erase trauma. Some refused the money on principle. Others took it through gritted teeth, knowing it was blood money wrapped in legal parchment. The payments came with strings, always with strings. Recipients had to agree not to sue their accusers. The trials became legend faster than history. By the 720s, ministers were already using Salem as a cautionary tale about mass hysteria, while carefully avoiding mention of their own predecessors' role in encouraging it. The story got sanded down, simplified into a parable about false accusations rather than a systemic failure. Easier to blame a few hysterical girls than examine why adults had indulged them. Economic consequences lingered longest. Farmers who'd abandoned fields during the panic found them overgrown. Craftsmen whose reputations had been ruined never recovered their clientele. The entire region developed a reputation for superstition that made outside investors wary. Tourism eventually fixed that, centuries later, ironically. But at the time, Salem became shorthand for backwater madness. The afflicted girls mostly faded into obscurity. No grand reckonings, no dramatic confessions, except Anne's. Some married young, others died in poverty. Their teenage theatrics had defined a colony's darkest year, then left them ill-equipped for mundane adult lives. Historians still debate how many truly believed their own accusations versus how many enjoyed the power, likely some of both. Meanwhile, confessed witches who'd survived lived with permanent stigma. Their admissions couldn't be undone, even if coerced. Many left Massachusetts entirely, starting over where no one knew their past. Those who stayed faced constant suspicion. If they'd lied then, could they be trusted now? The court had created a perfect trap: confess and be damned, deny and be hanged. Churches quietly stopped preaching about witchcraft so explicitly. Sermons shifted focus from Satan's imminent threats to more abstract moral failings. Ministers still talked about evil, but less about pinching spectres and more about general sinfulness. A practical adjustment, hard to maintain witch panic when your congregation includes people you wrongly accused. Forgiveness proved scarcer than pardon documents. Families of the executed nursed grudges for generations. Graves went untended. Property boundaries were forgotten when it inconvenienced certain families. The social fabric didn't tear so much as develop permanent wrinkles that no amount of political smoothing could fix. What's chilling is how ordinary life resumed. People still married, farmed, prayed, just with new awareness of how easily neighbours could turn. That knowledge changes a community. The trials didn't end because Salem learned some grand lesson. They ended because everyone got tired of the tension. Sometimes horror fades not through resolution but exhaustion. And yet, walk through Salem today and you'll see tourists snapping selfies at witch museums. The town has monetized its shame so thoroughly that the real history risks becoming kitsch. There's something deeply human in that. Our ability to package even our worst moments as entertainment. The memorial exists, yes, but so do t-shirt shops selling "I got witch trialed in Salem" shirts. Time turns tragedy into tourism eventually. The real legacy wasn't in official proclamations, but in quiet changes. Juries became warier of spectral evidence. Courts demanded higher standards. People remembered, even if they pretended not to, how quickly fear could override reason. The trials became America's original sin, a reminder that no community is immune to collective madness. Most survivors just wanted to move on. But move on to what? The world they'd known before the accusations was gone. Their trust in neighbours? Shattered. Their sense of safety? Irreparable. You can rebuild houses faster than communities. Some wounds never fully heal, they just stop bleeding. Salem's ultimate lesson wasn't about witchcraft at all. It was about the lies we tell ourselves and others to survive, and the price we pay when those lies grow too big to contain. The trials didn't end because truth won out. They ended because the web of falsehoods became unsustainable. That's the real horror story. Not that it happened, but that it could easily happen again. The seeds are always there, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. So before you dismiss Salem as some primitive anomaly, look around. The names and details change, but the pattern repeats wherever fear outpaces facts. The witch trials didn't end in 1693, they just took different forms. We don't burn witches anymore. We just find new labels for the people we're scared of. The methods evolve, the human weakness behind them doesn't. The Salem witch trials weren't about witchcraft, they were about what happens to human brains under fear. That's the uncomfortable truth. The Puritans weren't some uniquely superstitious cult. They were ordinary people reacting the way any stressed, isolated community would when bad things keep happening with no clear explanation. Replace witches with communists, terrorists, or whatever your era's boogeyman is, and the pattern holds. Fear doesn't need facts, it just needs a vacuum where answers should be. Picture that winter. Crops failing, children convulsing, neighbours dropping dead without reason. When reality makes no sense, people will invent explanations. The more vivid, the better. A bad harvest could be random bad luck, or it could be your neighbour's evil eye. Which story feels more satisfying? Which one gives you someone to blame? The human mind hates uncertainty more than it hates being wrong. What's chilling is how logical the panic seemed at the time. The girls' fits provided proof. Confessions lined up with sermons about Satan's tricks. Even the lack of physical evidence became evidence. Of course, witches would cover their tracks. The trials weren't a breakdown of reason. They were reason twisted to serve fear's agenda. Once you accept the premise that invisible demons walk among you, everything confirms it. A cough, a dream, a coincidental death, all pieces fitting neatly into the paranoid puzzle. Studies now show that scared people literalize metaphors. If you're primed to see evil, you'll spot it in a sideways glance. The Puritans didn't have fMRI scans, but they had front-row seats to this phenomenon. When the minister shouted about Satan's invisible fingers, suddenly kids felt phantom pinches. When the Bible warned of tongues of fire, the afflicted saw burning spectres. Fear doesn't just distort perception, it rewrites it. Group dynamics pour gasoline on the fire. In normal times, someone might have questioned why Satan only attacked certain families. But dissent became dangerous fast. Once a few people bought in, social pressure did the rest. Nodding along felt safer than risking suspicion. Historians call this pluralistic ignorance, when everyone privately doubts but publicly agrees, creating the illusion of consensus. By the time someone brave enough spoke up, the train had left the station. It's how easily they convinced themselves it was justice. Our brains are wired to rationalize terrible choices after the fact. Judges who'd sentenced toddlers to jail later claimed they'd done God's work. Accusers remembered their lies as holy visions. Memory isn't a recording. It's a story we edit to live with ourselves. Salem shows what happens when an entire town engages in mass self-deception. Confession became the ultimate feedback loop. Each admission proved witchcraft existed, justifying harsher interrogations that produced more confessions. Modern cops see this with false confessions. Exhausted, terrified people will admit to anything to stop the pain. Salem's magistrates didn't need waterboarding. Isolation, threats, and sleep deprivation worked fine. When keeping silent means death and lying means survival, truth becomes irrelevant. The trials collapsed only when fear conflicted with self-interest. Accuse a beggar? This wasn't enlightenment. It's the same calculus every witch hunt makes. It's not wrong until it hurts the wrong people. Modern equivalents play out in boardrooms and politics daily. Principle bows to power every time. It's that under the right conditions, economic stress, entrenched power structures, a charismatic leader framing dissent as treason, we'd do exactly the same. Maybe not with nooses and spectral evidence, but with laws, media, and social shunning. Most scary, how ordinary the participants were, not monsters, not zealots, just people who wanted safety, order, and someone to blame for their suffering. That's the psychological tripwire. The banality of evil isn't that evil people are ordinary. It's that ordinary people, given the right fears, will do evil and call it virtue. Watch any modern moral panic unfold. The language changes, satanic becomes woke or extremist, but the playbook stays identical. Isolate the group, amplify niche cases as trends, dismiss counter-evidence as part of the conspiracy. Salem's legacy isn't in the gallows, but in recognizing these patterns in ourselves. The trials didn't end because people stopped being afraid. They ended because terror finally reached those who could fight back. That's the final ugly lesson. Fear works until it's your neck on the line. Then, miraculously, standards reappear. We call it human nature. Next time you're certain someone's the villain in your story, ask, "Am I terrified?" or thinking clearly. Salem whispers that the difference might not be real. The true witchcraft wasn't spells. It was making good people believe the worst about each other. 3 centuries later, that magic spell still works just fine. Spellcheck won't catch it, neither will your conscience. That's why we keep staring into Salem's black mirror. Not to judge the past, but to recognize ourselves in its glass. Salem isn't some distant historical oddity. It's a mirror we keep walking past and pretending not to recognize ourselves in. We remember these trials not because Puritans were uniquely superstitious, but because they were human. And humans keep falling into the same traps, just with different labels. Every generation gets its own version of spectral evidence and pressed confessions. The names change. The patterns don't. Find a marginalized group, blame them for society's problems, then watch as accusations spread faster than facts. The Puritans had spectral pinches. The technology updates, but the human psychology behind mass panic stays stubbornly the same. What makes Salem stick in our collective memory isn't the tragedy itself, history's full of those. It's the terrifying normalcy of how it happened. No mustache-twirling villains, no elaborate conspiracies. Just ordinary people who woke up one day and decided their neighbors' weird habits must be signs of satanic allegiance. The scariest part? You can trace the exact moment when reasonable caution curdled into paranoia. Every historical atrocity starts with someone saying, "This time it's different." Salem proved that given enough stress, economic, political, social, any community can talk itself into abandoning due process. Security theatre beats real security when people are scared enough. We like to think we're more evolved now, but you can see the same instincts kick in whenever a new panic flares up. The players change costumes, but the script remains recognizable. The trials resonate because they expose how fragile civilization actually is. It doesn't take much to unravel. Just sustained fear and a few persuasive voices insisting they know who's to blame. Our modern systems aren't immune. Change a few variables, apply enough pressure, and suddenly you're watching the 21st century version of Neighbour, testifying against Neighbour. Due process becomes soft on witches. Critical thinking becomes defending the enemy. This isn't hypothetical. You've seen it happen in your lifetime. We remember Salem specifically because it wasn't exceptional. The same conditions that fueled 1692 keep recurring. Economic instability, political divisions, fear of outsiders. The Puritans didn't have terms like othering or moral panic, but they understood the concepts intimately. Their witch trials only lasted a year because they ran out of accepted targets. Most modern versions are more polite and therefore longer lasting. There's a reason Salem gets taught in schools while larger historical tragedies sometimes fade. It's the perfect case study. Small enough to wrap your head around, but comprehensive in its lessons. Like a controlled lab experiment in how societies self-destruct. The court records preserve every step of the progression, from reasonable suspicion to outright madness. The receipts, so to speak, didn't get burned. That's rare in history. We also remember because the aftermath stings. The half-hearted apologies. The lukewarm reparations. A corporation issues a non-apology. A politician pivots to new talking points. Everyone agrees things went too far, but no one wants to examine why they went there in the first place. Salem's aftermath proves accountability is messier than justice. What keeps Salem relevant isn't the witchcraft angle, it's the cautionary tale about power structures. Once the trials gained momentum, the system protected itself first. Accusations only slowed when they threatened powerful people. Moral panics never die from moral realizations. They end when they start inconveniencing the wrong folks. At its core, Salem teaches us to watch the mechanisms, not the costumes. When people start accepting shoddy evidence because it confirms their fears, that's the warning sign. When leaders benefit from fanning paranoia instead of calming it, that's the red flag. The trial transcripts read like horror stories now, but in the moment, everything felt justified. That cognitive dissonance should unsettle you. It means we're all capable of sleepwalking into similar mistakes. The past isn't some foreign country. It's right here, just with worse dentistry. Human nature hasn't upgraded its operating system since 1692. We have better technology now, but the same ancient brain wiring that made Salem possible still drives our decisions. That's why we keep coming back to this story, not to gawk at how backward they were, but to recognize the warning signs in ourselves. Salem endures because it asks uncomfortable questions we still can't answer. How do you protect a society from its own fearful instincts? Where's the line between vigilance and paranoia? When does precaution become persecution? Tituba's story survives, but not on her own terms. She became Salem's first confessor, its most cooperative prisoner, and ultimately its most vexing historical footnote. History remembers what she said, not who she was. Her confession set the template. When magistrates pressed her, she gave them exactly what they craved, vivid details about devil's books and spectral animals. The more she invented, the safer she became. While others hung for maintaining innocence, Tituba lived by spinning tales. Smart woman. Her survival strategy worked, right up until it made her inconvenient to the official narrative. After the trials, she vanishes from the records, sold to pay her jail fees, dead in some unmarked grave. No one bothered to document it. The paradox gnaws at you. Tituba was both powerless and enormously influential, an enslaved woman whose words condemned dozens, yet who couldn't control her own fate. Her confession launched the trials, yet she never testified about its veracity. She gave the court its founding mythology, then disappeared before the reckoning. History likes clear victims and villains. Tituba was neither, just a person making impossible choices in a system rigged against her. Modern retellings paint her as everything from a voodoo priestess to a proto-feminist rebel. Both miss the point. The real Tituba was probably just trying not to die. Her Caribbean background made her exotic enough to be believable as a witch, but foreign enough that no one would take her side. When survival depends on performing someone else's nightmares, you learn the script fast. The court records show her evolving tactics. Early testimony hesitates. Later statements burst with lurid details. The red rat, the yellow bird, the tall man from Boston. Each new confession brought another day above ground. Meanwhile, people hanged because of her words. That weight never lifted. What chills isn't her actions, but how easily the system exploited them. Tituba's confession became Salem's Rosetta Stone. Suddenly every odd event fit her template. A child's nightmare wasn't just a dream, it was a witch's spectral visit. Failed crops weren't bad luck, they were Satan's handiwork. Once she provided the vocabulary of witchcraft, everyone started speaking it fluently. Her disappearance speaks volumes. After jump-starting the trials, Tituba became an embarrassment, a living reminder that witches were invented under pressure. The same court that hung on her every word later paid a jailer to take her away. No farewells, no final testimony. Just a line item in an account book, human collateral for unpaid debts. Historians still argue about her origins. Was she native South American, African, mixed race? The debates matter because we crave categories. But Tituba's power came from being indefinable. An outsider who could personify the colony's fears without triggering anyone's loyalty. All say more about the storytellers than the woman herself. The real Tituba survives only in court documents, her voice filtered through white male scribes. Even her famous confession comes to us third-hand. We know what she supposedly said, not what she actually thought. That unknowable quality makes her haunting. The other accused witches fit clearer patterns. The outspoken woman, the grieving widow, the property-disputing neighbour. Tituba resists easy typing. Her motivations blur. Her end remains mysterious. She's the human shadow at Salem's center. The trials needed her more than they'd admit. Without Tituba's initial confession, the dominoes might not have fallen. Yet official accounts minimized her role quickly. Ministers praised the afflicted girl's courage but ignored the enslaved woman who gave them their script. Convenient that. Here's what we can say for certain. Tituba understood the game better than anyone. When survival meant performance, she gave the performance of her life. When silence meant safety, she disappeared completely. In a society that treated people as property, she used the only leverage she had, her words, and paid the price when they weren't needed anymore. Her ultimate legacy isn't in the accusations or even the lives lost. It's in the uncomfortable question she leaves hanging. How many historical truths were just desperate lies told under pressure? The court called Tituba a witch. History should call her what she was, a survivor in an unwinnable situation. Salem rebuilt itself by forgetting. The monuments remember the hanged, not the coerced. The museums celebrate the town's resilience, not its failures. Tituba's absence from these narratives is telling. We commemorate victims more easily than complicities. Maybe that's why her ghost won't rest. Not because she was supernatural, but because her story exposes how brittle our distinctions between villain and victim really are. The enslaved woman who saved herself by damning others doesn't fit morality tales. She forces us to sit with harder truths about power, fear, and what people will do to survive. 3 centuries later, Tituba still won't be categorized. Not quite a perpetrator, not quite a martyr. Just a human being who got crushed by history's wheels, then vanished into its cracks. The trials bear her fingerprints, even as the history books try to wipe them clean. That tension between her centrality and her erasure might be the most honest monument Salem could have. That winter of 692 froze more than crops and rivers. It froze Salem's collective conscience. When spring finally came, the snow melted, but the chill lingered. People who'd accused their neighbours now had to pass them in the fields. Brothers who testified against sisters sat across from empty chairs at family meals. The warming air didn't touch the cold space where trust used to be. The trials ended, but none of the real problems got solved. Failed farms stayed barren. Political tensions simmered. Illness still took children unpredictably. Only now, Salem had no witches left to blame. The hangings didn't fix anything. They just left the town with fresh graves and older grudges. Some survivors moved away. Others stayed, pretending not to notice how conversations stopped when they entered rooms. What happened in Salem wasn't weather, it was climate. A permanent shift in how people viewed each other. Now every sneeze carried echoes of suspicion. The afflicted girls grew up, married, had children of their own, but no one ever looked at them quite the same again. The kind of fear Salem experienced doesn't evaporate. It seeps into foundations. You can track the damage in land records. Families who'd accused each other found themselves disputing property lines for generations. Church membership rolls show gaps where accused families used to sit. Even decades later, marriages between accuser and accused families were rare. The social fabric didn't tear, it misstitched itself permanently. Some wounds never fully heal, they just scab over weakly. The physical scars faded faster than the psychological ones. Gallows Hill greened over, graves went unmarked by design. People rebuilt houses and replanted fields, but the landscape of trust remained altered. A generation later, Salem was prospering outwardly. Wharves busy, shops full, churches crowded. But beneath that veneer, the fractures still ran deep. You don't recover from watching your town eat itself alive. Memories got edited for comfort. Some accusers later insisted they'd been bewitched, others claimed they'd been misunderstood. A few just stopped talking about it entirely. People didn't repent so much as reframe, focusing on their own suffering rather than the pain they'd caused. The official apologies came late and rang hollow. No one restored the dead to life. No trial undid a single hanging. The economic costs kept compounding long after the last execution. Salem developed a reputation that scared off investors. Skilled craftsmen moved elsewhere. Properties linked to the trials lost value. Even attempts at memorializing the dead became arguments. Where to put the monument, what words to carve, who should pay for it. The divisions outlasted the people who'd created them. What makes Salem's winter metaphor so apt isn't the cold snap of the trials themselves, but the long thaw afterward. Freezing kills quickly. Unfreezing happens slowly, unevenly, some patches remaining stubbornly icy long after the rest has melted. You can mandate forgiveness. You can't mandate trust. Walk through Salem today and you'll see the contradictions everywhere. Which museums next to Puritan meeting houses? Families descended from accusers and accused living side by side, politely ignoring history. That's the real legacy. Not the terror of 1692, but the uneasy truce that followed. The coldest winters aren't measured in degrees. They're measured in silenced conversations, avoided glances, forced smiles between people who used to be friends. Salem's deepest freeze wasn't the months of accusations. It was the decades of awkward Thanksgivings afterward. The kind of chill no fireplace can touch. Tourists come hoping to see where evil happened. They leave having seen something more unsettling, where ordinary people happen to evil. The real horror isn't that Salem went mad for a year, it's that afterward, everyone had to pretend they hadn't. That's the winter that never lifted, not the fear of witches, but the knowledge of what neighbours could do to neighbours. The trials became Salem's ghost, not because of supernatural whispers, but because they forced an uncomfortable truth into the open. Civilization is fragile. Decency depends on daily choices, not ancient virtues. One bad winter can undo centuries of community. That realization settled over Salem like a second frost, one that never quite melted even when the trees leafed out again. We remember the hangings, but forget the living. Relatives of the executed who had to rebuild in a town that killed their loved ones. Accusers who had to live with consequences they couldn't take back. Even the judges, some of whom spent their later years wrestling with guilt in private letters. It was every year after, when people woke up remembering what they'd done. Winter doesn't end all at once. Some days feel like spring, then frost returns overnight. Salem learned this the hard way. You can pardon the dead, you can't pardon yourself. The trials stopped, but the thermometer stayed stuck below freezing for generations. Maybe that's the true cautionary tale. Not how fast panic spreads, but how long the chill lingers after the storm passes. Kids wear witch hats where people once hanged. The ultimate irony, Salem profits from the very thing that almost destroyed it. The thaw finally came, but not before changing everything. That's what real winters do, they leave landscapes permanently altered, even after they're gone. The cold snap of 692 taught Salem something awful about human nature. Given the right conditions, any community can turn on itself. Not through evil, but through fear. Not through monsters, but through ordinary people making small compromises that add up to horror. The deepest freeze wasn't outside. It was in the human heart. And once it takes hold, no fire burns hot enough to melt it completely. Salem's never fully warmed up from that winter. You can feel it even now, in the careful way descendants of accusers and accused interact, in the town's complicated relationship with its own history. Some frosts never lift. They just become part of the landscape, invisible unless you know where to look. The coldest seasons aren't marked on calendars. They're engraved in silences between generations. The Salem witch trials show what happens when fear takes the wheel. A community starving for answers will invent monsters rather than face uncertainty. But the real horror wasn't witches. It was watching neighbours turn on each other so easily. We like to think we're more rational now, but the ingredients haven't changed. Stress. Fear of the unknown. Leaders who benefit from panic. Swap witchcraft for whatever your era's boogeyman is. And suddenly Salem doesn't feel so distant. So tell me in the comments, what chills you most about this story? Subscribe if you want more history that keeps you up at night, for all the wrong reasons.